This video is part of a series on experiences of the Enneagram from the 27 subtypes. I'm aiming to interview people of each subtype so you get to hear and experience what those different voices and life experiences sound like. I hope you enjoy. Hi, Steph. Thank you for taking the time to share with us today. Would you be able to share with us the country that you live in, your Enneagram type, subtype, and instinctual sequence?
Yes. So I live in the United States and I live in California within the US. I am an Enneagram 3 sexual subtype, and then self-pres and social is the rest of the stack.
Thank you, Steph. So when it comes to the Enneagram, when did you first hear about it?
Probably in 2015. I'd heard whispers about it prior to that, but I've always been interested in personality, anything. So even when I was in undergrad and college, I studied psychology because I wanted to learn about personality. So I've always been kind of into that. And so in 2015, my husband heard about it on a podcast, which is called the Liturgist Podcast, if people are familiar with that. And he's like, "Hey, you would be into this." And I was like, "Oh, that's nice." And he handed me his ready results. And I was like, "Well, that's nice, whatever. Like that makes some sense for you, but I'm good with these other systems that I have going on right now." And then about 6 months later, my older sister, so in 2016, my older sister was like, "You have to get into the Enneagram." You know, so she made me take a test and I did what you're supposed to do when an older sister tells you to do something, which is I took the test. And yeah, the rest is history.
Okay, thanks for sharing that. So what were the other personality systems that you were involved with at the time, or maybe still are?
So mainly total SDI. And I think it has a bit of a different name now, but it's a motivation based assessment and it's actually more of like a triangle. So there are three components to the triangle: assertive, altruistic, and analytical. And then in the center, there's like a hub. So you can either be, and each of them corresponds to a color. So it's like, I'm a red, or I'm a red blue, or I'm a hub, or I'm a red green, that sort of thing.
Okay.
Um, so that's what we used at my workplace. And I was in management there. And so I just saw how well it helped our management team. And I just loved it. So I was not really interested in layering on anything else. Though, of course, like everyone, I've done DISC and MBTI and all those sorts of things.
Okay, thanks for sharing that, Steph. So since 2015, after getting the encouragement from Big Sis, what's been your general experience of the Enneagram?
Yeah. So, well, when I first took the assessment, it popped up and it said the achiever. And I was like, yes, I won. Of course. And shortly thereafter, so this is before even The Road Back to You, which I do think The Road Back to You by Ian Cron and Suzanne Spiel really popularized the Enneagram. So this was before that book even came out. And I didn't know a lot about where to find information. So I ordered a few books. Like I think I ordered The Wisdom of the Enneagram, The Complete Enneagram. And then when The Road Back to You came out, I got that one. I was so excited about it. And I remember reading about my type and being like, oh my gosh, like having this overwhelming sense of like, oh my gosh, people can see me. Because I had recently been noticing my tendency to be a little bit different at work versus at church versus at, other friends, whatever. And I had been noticing that about myself. And then I saw that that was a big thing about type threes. And I was just like mortified. I just could not believe that people could see me and I felt so exposed. And I remember just sitting on my balcony at the time. I was in this little apartment and just feeling like, oh, please, can I be a different type?
Okay.
um, and I think I have always been a fairly self-critical person. And so, which I think sometimes people do not associate with type three. But it's definitely true for me. But I have always been fairly self-critical. And so I think I was really attracted to the part about the Enneagram that really looked at your blind spots and kind of said, like, each of these types kind of sucks in these 9 specific ways. So that kind of started this journey for me of taking those little bits of insight from being so mortified that people could see me. And then also like looking at these other blind spots and trying to understand, okay, how do I grow from here? Where do I go? And I heard Suzanne Stabile at the time say, because I wasn't familiar with being Irania yet or anything like that, right?
Mm.
So I heard Suzanne say, learn for 2 years before you start teaching. And so I took that advice to heart, which I think is actually really healthy for a 3. It's not
Mhm.
normally how I would do things for sure, especially at that time. And I waited a couple years, and then I had another business that wound down. And then I was like, oh, I want a different business. So I started making coffee mugs for each Enneagram type.
Cool.
I like developed these different like icons. It's actually kind of funny because right after I published them, a different creator copied them and like has sold them, but whatever. That's just how that type of thing works. But that's why I started 9 Types Co. So that's my company. And I started 9 Types then. And that was 2017. And then in 2018, people started asking me, hey, will you come and teach this? And that kind of sent me on this entire journey of where I am today.
Wow. Just out of interest, the self criticism piece, is that the words that
Mm-hmm.
you used? Being self
Yeah.
critical. What's your understanding of where that came from? Both
Yeah.
within the Enneagram, how would you understand that within the Enneagram system, and also maybe outside of it as well?
Well, 2 different pieces. So I grew up in the evangelical church here in the United States, and I don't know what it's like elsewhere in the world. I've heard that it's a bit different, but the spaces I grew up in were very hell bent on this concept of you are innately evil. And
Okay.
so you have to overcome this, but you can't. So the only way to do that is God, and anything that comes from you is evil. Anything that you want is bad and evil. Only God's will is good, right? So I think that was kind of ingrained in me. And we'll get to the subtype more in a minute, but like as the sexual 3, um, it's really hard to have like that innate sense of self anyway. And so if somebody says you're innately evil, and that's what I'm told my entire life, like I had one pastor, this was as an adult, but I had one pastor who always said, you're wicked, depraved, and deserving of death all the time. Right. So that's the messaging that I internalized. And so I think a lot of it came from that. I also recently have learned that I have OCD. And so I think that that blends in as well. I see a lot of overlap between OCD and like that upbringing of thinking, if I make a mistake, I will go straight to hell. Like, or God might smite me, like God might strike me down. Um,
Yeah.
because I remember going to like as a young child going to like summer camp and learning like if you lie, God will smite you, God will kill you instantaneously.
Wow.
Uh, so I think that there's a lot of overlap there, right? And then the other thing that I can just notice is when we read from Beatrice Chestnut and the Complete Enneagram, and she talks about 3s, sexual 3s in particular. They do tend to be more self-critical, have a more difficult time with self-esteem, um, and have a more difficult time just like feeling good or confident about themselves anyway. And I think that people look at some of the descriptions of sexual 3 about being quote unquote Barbie like. Um, and people look at that and think, well, they're not insecure. But that isn't necessarily the case. So I think that that's an important thing to look at, especially I think self-pres and sexual 3s tend to be a lot more self-critical than they let others see. I mean, I definitely have done typing interviews where people thought, just like, when we do interview circles and we practice,
Yeah.
I've definitely had people think that I was a 1. Um,
Okay.
but I, I'm not a 1.
Okay. Sorry, Steph. Would you mind? Would you
Yeah.
remind me again what you said your sequence was?
Sexual, self-pres, social.
Okay. So how close is the self-preservation to your dominant?
would you say?
It's quite close, I'd say. Um, it's close. I see it come up a lot, but I see my behavior a lot more, like in my daily life, a lot more dictated by the sexual
Sure.
instinct. Hmm.
Okay. Because I've talked sometimes about how the lookalike subtypes are a thing. And I wonder also if we've got like the lookalike subtype, self-preservation 3, self-preservation 1 can be a lookalike type, but not necessarily the sexual 3 and the self-preservation 1. However, if the self-preservation instinct is quite close to your dominant, I wonder if we can get some lookalike types in the sequencing as well. Like we can pick up some of the lookalikes with the sequence.
Yes, but also consider for sexual 3, you have to look at who is around this person. So my parents
Yeah.
are a 1 and a 6.
There we go.
So
Yeah.
right, so we're going to see a
Yeah.
lot of that 1 come out, especially, and 6, but in this case we're talking more about the type 1.
Yeah.
So I think that comes out. I will also say I've done, I don't know how many typing interviews, hundreds probably,
Wow.
and there have been very few times when I get to that question, how self-critical are you, that people say they're not self-critical. Most people are fairly self-critical. Um, but it's the context and the content of the self-criticism that I think really dictates where I kind of sort their self-criticism into. Like, I think ones are generally pretty harsh, like, like we all know that. But I think other people feel self-critical as well.
Mm. Yeah, I agree. And as you'll know, and as maybe people that are listening will know as well, maybe not, that of course our parents are going to have a massive impact on us, aren't they? Of course they
Mhm.
are. So
Mhm.
obviously, if you've got a type 6 parent and you're arrow to 6, you've already got the connection to 6 there already. So a parent that's a 6 is going to, influence that arrow, for better, for worse,
Mhm.
healthier, unhealthier, you name it. And obviously a type 1 parent is going to flavor you, is going to have an impact as well, of course. And as well as the cultural piece. I mean, the way that you were describing your experience of a presentation of evangelical Christianity where you live, um, I dare say that there are different expressions, well, that there are different expressions of Christianity around the world. But
Of
just
course.
listening to how you described it makes God sound like, if a parent said that to a child, you'd think it was abuse. It would be like
Mhm.
abusive, and you think, how is that meant to foster like a loving connection? How is that meant to? Um, I don't know. I just don't imagine Jesus saying it to somebody. If that
Yeah, and
makes
I think
sense.
that theological perspective really emphasizes the concept of fearing God versus loving, right?
Yes.
Um,
Interesting. Yeah.
mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. I was funny enough. I was only thinking about this yesterday because it came up in a conversation with somebody I was having, and I was telling them about the Enneagram. And my type is I'm passion. I didn't use the word passion or fear, but I've said that I've come to realize about myself how fear is motivating most of my actions, as is the case with all of the 9 types. As you'll know, the passion is like in the driving seat of our lives, isn't it? Um, and and then she sort of reflected back to me, but yes, but fearing God is a good thing. I was like, yeah. So the fear, having a healthy fear is a good thing. If I was driving towards the edge of a cliff, I need to have a healthy fear of death, to a point. And maybe that's a self-preservation dominant speaking here. But then I would say that would be common sense. However, there is the fear of, if perfect love hasn't been perfected in us, and fear is blocking love, then that's an unhealthy use of fear, if
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Well, and I think, forgive me because I did play a lot of Bubble Bazinga. So if anybody
Okay.
remembers that game,
No.
during my Old
It's okay.
Testament theology classes,
Excellent.
but if I remember correctly, the word that they use for fear is different from how we interpret fear now. So in the original languages, it's a different word. It's not the same way that we think of like fear. So
Interesting. Do you remember
I
what
don't know. You're the actual professional at this, but That's just what I
Yeah.
remember from.
No, not I would, in fact, I'm getting to a stage in my life where I have more questions and less answers, and I have less certainty and more uncertainty. And I think there's a couple of things going on here. There's the self-preservation 6 uncertainty piece. So growing into certainty would be a growth path for a self-preservation 6. But there's also like another piece of, and I don't know whether some people might look at me and go, he's going sideways, or actually he's maturing. I don't want to be arrogant and say I'm maturing, but I hope I am. But there's a lot of questions that maybe we won't have the answers to this side.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think so as I'm sure that you can kind of hear in some of my answers and stuff, I did grow up in that scenario. And in the past several years, I've been really deconstructing all of that. And I don't identify as Christian now. I don't really know. I don't really have a label, and I'm fine with that. But it's been really a practice of moving away from like this need for certainty and this need for that black and white perspective, and like needing everything to be sorted. Because I think as a 3, we really like that. We really like for things to feel sorted, right? Like sorted out.
Tick.
And so,
job done.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think it's been a big growing process of being able to say, okay, I actually don't know, and becoming more and more okay with not knowing, and still finding some way to have these other things that are important for us as like in basic human development, of like having a sense of identity. For example, because I was always told, well, your identity is in Christ. If you could tell me what exactly that means, that would be fantastic, right? I never quite could grasp it. And so as a sexual 3 who has all these issues around, like these big questions and big issues around identity anyway, that wasn't all that helpful. And so over the last several years, it's been a process of developing and answering those questions of like, who am I? Which I gather are questions that some other types never ask, which sounds glorious to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think that who am I question is a profound question. And I've heard that is true, especially for sexual 3s as well. The who am I question. So what has that journey been like for you? In this season of life, like that. Who are you?
Great question. Well, I think I still don't know how to define it. I can say like, I like what I like, right? So, I like to read, like that's probably the main like defining characteristic. And that's actually been something that's been true my entire life. And this is something I've been thinking about lately, like what do I have in common with my 10-year-old self? Right?
Yeah.
So, bringing home a stray dog that I found on the road. Got that in common. Baking, I've always loved like baking and like those sort of creative things. And just kind of having like this very experimental approach to a lot of that stuff. I really enjoy like that experience of, just trying something new. Like, yeah, the recipe says this, but like, let's try this. And I've always been that way. And I like to be like kind and thoughtful, but also fun. I tend to have a bit of a dark sense of humor. I don't know. Does that answer anything? I don't know.
Yeah. Thank you, Steph. No, thank you for sharing that. So since 2015, how would you say the Enneagram has been specifically helpful to you?
Yeah. So I can talk a little bit about my career first, and then I'll also just talk about the inner work part. So I started writing about the Enneagram on Instagram in 2018 because I noticed, like I mentioned before, I had the coffee mugs, but people really liked it when I talked about this is what this type looks like. And so I started creating like these infographics. And at the time I was told that won't work on Instagram. Infographics, text, not going to work. Like only images work on Instagram. Obviously we see now that's not the case. But I just tried it. And then carousels came out, which are perfect. So you could like swipe through and do 10 different posts. So I just started writing about the Enneagram online and sharing it, and people really enjoyed it. And I think people enjoyed it because I would ask them what they actually thought about things and then use my knowledge of the Enneagram and kind of combine them. And also during that time, I did my very first Enneagram certification. So that was in 2018. And then I started asking some of these questions that we're talking about now, right? Like, who am I? Like, what do I care about? What do I value? And I started going back to, the times when I was most fulfilled in my career was when I was using this other assessment system at work, because it really was helpful for my communication and my relationships and stuff like that. And I was in a job that was totally different from that. And I thought, okay, I'm going to go back to school and get a master's in organizational communication. And so it's kind of a blend between organization development and organizational communication, or in communication studies. So went back to school and did that, and did a lot of my work even within that program on like the Enneagram and applying the Enneagram in corporate settings. And throughout that time, there's also the pandemic in part. So I just was like still posting on Instagram, still writing about it. I also wrote a book during that time.
Wow.
And so I had all these different things happening, and just continued working with the Enneagram. But I have a tendency to be a bit of a skeptic. And so if everyone likes something, I'm like, okay, but there's some way that this doesn't work, right? There's some way that there's a hole here.
Okay.
And so a friend of mine told me, you'll just fall back in love with the Enneagram if you go to Chestnut Pies Academy. And so I did, and she was right. And it's been a fantastic journey. So I went to Chestnut Pies. I also did the IEQ 9 certification. So I have really loved Chestnut Pies, and this is more of the inner work piece, is I really love the way that they approach the Enneagram in terms of the inner work. And even to get your professional certification, you have to go to the retreats, or a retreat that is so focused on doing your own work. And I think that's really, really useful, because as a 3, I think I may have not done that otherwise.
Yeah.
Like there was somebody at my retreat that was like, it's so cool. You're so young, and you're here, you're spending your time and your money in 5 days here doing this retreat. And I was like, I mean, thank you. But also like, keep in mind that I'm required to do this to graduate from this program.
Interesting. Okay,
So,
yeah.
But yeah, it's just been such a fantastic experience. And I've met a lot of people, and, the thing I love about the Enneagram, whether it's for work or for inner work, is it really does give us a map, or like a shortcut of the same things that I see come up in these retreats, or the same things that I see come up in, even for my clients, like especially like working in corporate. It's like, they're like, oh, I definitely got the same exact feedback on my last performance review, right? And for me, the whole perspective of, wow, I care so much about what other people think. That comes up over and over, right? Because it's like, that's like a core thing. So I think that that's why I really like the Enneagram and have really appreciated that. And it's kind of brought me into all these different spaces that are probably really uncomfortable for somebody who is as task oriented as I used to be. I'd say I'm not really like that anymore, which we can talk about more. But yeah, it's been just like a really incredible opportunity.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Steph. And I know you said about the when you're doing the professional certification with CP Enneagram Academy, and you got the compliment. That was very vulnerable of of you sharing that. And you said, "Well, I'm kind of here because I'm after the certification, and whether or not you would have done it at that point or not, who knows? Maybe you would have done, maybe you wouldn't have done." And it relates back to what you said earlier of when someone said to you about the Enneagram, Susan Stabile, sit on it for 2 years before you go and teach it. And I find it's interesting how my self-preservation 6 subtype is the complete opposite to the type 3s in general. I'm like,
Yeah.
give me 20 years to prepare,
Yes.
and I might be ready. I might need another 20 years. But I love the 3s. It's like, wow, you get the information, and now I'm ready to go. I'm ready to teach. So I need to be more like that. And I'm inspired by the type 3, but for the type 3, they've got to do the opposite. They've got to, slow down. I've got to speed up. They've got to slow down. It's interesting, isn't it? How the growth path for each of the types and subtypes can be so different.
Yeah.
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 It's
interesting.
Yeah. Are you at a place now where you would want to do the inner retreats, more of the inner work than what
I
you did back
definitely
along?
would. Yeah, I would. And I think that they've been just so helpful. For me right now, I just don't really have capacity to do that.
Sure.
In terms of, I try it, if it were up to me, I would spend every cent I make in my business on retreats and learning and everything like that, like getting different certifications and going to courses, all that stuff. But as it turns out, that doesn't necessarily always pay the mortgage. So I have to like kind of pare that back a bit. But I would. Yeah, I would love to.
Yeah, I hear you. Going back to what you shared a minute ago about caring, it matters to you what people think. Because that's true for me as well, and maybe that's true. Maybe that's true for most people. However, as you'll also know and appreciate, our behaviors, like I might care about what people think of me for X reasons, and a sexual 3 might care about what people think about them for another set of reasons. What other set of reasons why you care or used to care about what people think about you?
Yeah. I think for 3s, there's this real fear that there's nothing inside.
Okay.
Like I started realizing this around the time I did Retreat A. So that was November 2022. And I started realizing like, oh, I feel like I'm like a conduit to other people's experience. And when I've said that to other 3s, especially sexual 3s, they're like, oh yes, I know exactly what you mean. But it's almost feeling like you're in a sitcom. And have you seen the TV show Kevin Can Fuck Himself?
No, I haven't seen that. No.
Okay. So it's like one of those like classic American sitcoms where you've got the guy who's like kind of misogynist and then whenever he's not on screen, the lights are out. Everything is like in squalor. There's like roaches on the floor. And it's like everything doesn't exist when he's not there, but when he's there, the lights are on.
Okay.
And I think in some ways that's what I mean, where it's like almost like if the other people aren't around, I don't exist. That makes sense. So, and then even in individual spaces, this is not necessarily how I think now, but I just started noticing like that was like my default mode about life. So like even, when I go to visit my family, I would go into this mode of like, it doesn't matter if I'm enjoying this or if I'm having a good experience. Like I would never even think about that. It would be all about what am I doing to make sure everyone else is having a good time? What do I need to do to make this work or make this happen? To help people, to make food for them, whatever else needed to happen. And almost like I could prove my worth by doing things for other people.
Okay. So it sounds, I've heard it said that the sexual threes can be a bit two-ish. Sounds like, in some ways, that sounds a bit two-ish. I also
Yeah.
wonder if it's related to the passion of self-deceit. That
hmm
passion,
So
yeah.
yeah, I think, yeah, that whole experience of like, I am who you say that I am, who you believe that I am. And I think for the sexual three, that especially is tied to specific people. So like your spouse, for example, that's, you know, a lot of how it is for me, or like specific family members. Um, and so what's difficult about it is sometimes like I have other people in my life who actually think really positively about me, but that doesn't actually matter. I'm like, oh, you just
Right.
like don't see me clearly.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And uh but I do think that in general, like the self-deceit thing is huge. I've just and in a lot of my life I've thought, am I 7 or am I 3? Um
Okay.
at times. Or even like, am I 4 or am I 3? Or am I 6 or am I 3? You know what I mean? Like all these different types.
Yeah.
But one of the things for me that I keep going back to is like I could work on those other passions, right? Like I could do a lot of work around gluttony. Um, but the self-deceit part, like working with that actually helps me get to where I need to go.
Hmm. What's your take on, because I've heard it said by many teachers, Enneagram teachers, that we have all of the 9 types in us. It's just one of them is core. Do you hold that
Mhm.
belief that we are, if we were to map the human being onto the Enneagram, that the Enneagram as a system, we're talking about Enneagram of personality, but the Enneagram is like a system that can be applied to different things. So if we're going to
Mhm.
say the Enneagram of a human being, and we've got all 9 numbers in us, so we've got all of the weaknesses and the strengths to varying degrees for various reasons. Do you hold to that teaching?
Um, I mean, I guess theoretically, I don't really think about that much, though, to be
Okay,
honest.
sure. Yeah,
uh, because it's like almost too much, right? Like too many things to think about.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, absolutely. And I know that being around you are very keen on, stick to the basics, stick to the core, the passion and the fixation. That's going to keep enough people. That's going to keep most of us busy for the rest of our lives. Like that,
Mhm.
the passion of fear for me, even if I've got other passions at work within me, the passion of fear is probably going to be one that I need to keep coming back to again and again. And the more I develop, maybe the more clever it will get, and the more subtle
Mhm.
it will get, and the more, and I think that's possibly true for all of the passions. It's like,
Yeah.
just when I think that I've, conquered fear, like I'm still somehow in fear.
Mhm. Yes. And it almost feels in some way like when you are not thinking about it is when you're kind of not beyond it, but like aware of like, oh, there it goes again. And like, let's make a different choice, instead
Mm.
of thinking that you've conquered it or something. Um, but I think this is maybe my bent, but like, I don't know if you've heard this from other people, but for so much of my Enneagram journey was like, I have to banish everything about type 3 from who I am and my personality and the way that I show up, which has actually been really detrimental in my life.
Okay.
And I recently heard B say, yeah, healthy threes are really good at getting things done. And I was like, oh, right. Like, I don't have to be like, I never get anything done. And that's what health looks like for me.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not like the opposite of my functioning. It's like not letting like self deceit dictate what I'm doing, or not letting the fixation of vanity dictate what I'm doing.
Okay. So another way of understanding this, if I've got the understanding right, is say somebody makes a choice to go left, and I'll use my type as an example. I'm making a choice in this moment in my life to turn left, and I'm turning left because it's motivated by fear, Enneagram teaching would probably say, no, that is an unconscious or an underdeveloped choice. But if I was consciously choosing to turn left from a place of courage, it's the same choice, it's the same direction, but I'm not choosing to go there because I'm being driven by fear. I'm going there because it's actually courage in action, not fear.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the behavior can be the same, but what's motivating
Right.
it, I guess.
Yes. Yeah. And that's been eye-opening for me because I did the 3 thing, which is like I went all in on everything
Okay.
and really like got rid of all of my sense of motivation and like excitement to work. Cause every time that like, oh,
Okay.
I'm excited to do this thing, then there would be something in me that'd be like, no, you can't do that. You're supposed to do the opposite.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Okay. Yeah. So a constant questioning of yourself, almost, or
Yeah. Or like tamping down. I think also because I'm a sexual 3 and I'm married to a 6, I have, and my mom is a 6. I have such a big contrarian streak in me. That's like, or you should do the opposite.
okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And going back to what you shared earlier about gosh, I mean, if the sexual 3 is asking the question, who am I? 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 Um, and if I haven't got anybody around me, that image that you shared about that film when he goes back into his room and there's just cockroaches and there's just nothing. It's just, but what the image that came to my mind was just, it was just desolation. It was just, without the other, I am nothing. And that was just like a really powerful picture. And on top of that, with the sexual 3 going, who am I? Who am I? Who am I? If if I'm not the sexual 3, if I'm not doing the sexual 3 things, if I'm not getting the validation from these people, then who am I? Not only did you have that going on, but you had the actual really strong messaging that sounds like, from what you shared, it was being delivered to you on a regular basis. You are evil. You are, you're basically doomed. um, and so that's, yeah, sort of deconstructing from that is going to be, it's going to take some time.
Yeah, for sure. And it has. And I think like an example that can be helpful too for people is like I would be like, "Oh, there's a cool restaurant. I really want to go there." Oh, but like, I'll just wait until like I can go just like do date night with my husband or whatever, right? So I would kind of
Yeah.
put it off and say, "Oh, I'm not going to go there by myself." Um and I started realizing like my husband wouldn't do that. He'd be like, "Oh, I found a cool restaurant I'm going to go to." you know, he
Okay.
wouldn't put it off like that. And I started realizing like, "Oh, I was just assuming I'm not worthy of having like a nice lunch by myself." And one of the most helpful things for me has actually been traveling so much for work, because I try a lot of really great restaurants and I'm normally alone. So I have to be like, I'm going to just do this by myself. Like there is no option for my husband to come with me or to like get to share this with somebody else. And it's nice to be like, I'm going to choose to do something for myself, instead of being like, I'm going to wait until somebody else can experience this with me. And only then is it okay for me to experience it.
Okay. So almost like you're having a date with yourself, like hanging out with yourself, like being with yourself instead of doing for other people, or
Mhm.
yeah, doing in service of the persona.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and, I take my book and then I'm like in heaven because I'm like, I'm sitting here reading at a restaurant. Like, how nice is
Nice.
that? So,
Yeah, that sounds lovely. So what was your experience of discovering your type? Did you go straight in, read the book, and go 3, ouch, that's me, or what was your journey like of finding your type?
yeah. So like I mentioned, I saw a 3 and I was like, yep, that's me. Um, I always teach that our types are strongest ages 20 to 25. Like they're the most kind of like stereotypical and clear. And so I was right at the end of that when I figured out my type. And so I think it was really clear for me then. But I think over the years, well, one thing that's kind of funny is a friend or my older sister thought, she is always embarrassed when I say this, but it's okay. She was like, I feel like you're a 4.
Okay.
Like she really thought I was a 4. And that sent me on, because I was like, I feel like I'm a 3, but if she thinks I'm a 4, maybe I am a 4. Do you see the self-deceit?
Yeah.
Like,
Okay.
whatever you say that I am is what I am, right? But so I went on this whole journey with that. And then I finally felt like pretty solid with 3. And then I think especially I had a lot of really big life changes, 2019. And then of course the pandemic right after that.
Yeah.
And so I was diagnosed with ADHD, and I was like, wow, I'm not a 3 because I can't do anything and I can't pay attention to anything. And like I had all of these really, really awful things to say about all of that about myself. And so that made me think, well, I am like narcotizing a lot. Does that mean I'm a 9? And then even just like last year, I was like, am I actually a self-pres 7? Because I tend to be the type of person who has a bazillion ideas and starts everything and then is like, okay, let's move on to the next one. Like once I get it started, then I'm like, somebody else can finish this. I'll move on to the next thing. And then I was like, or am I a 6? Right. So I had all of these different questions. So it was like initially I resonated with 3, but then over the years, I've been like, oh, I don't know, maybe I'm this other type. You know what I mean? And so that has been challenging, but I really think that the sexual 3 in particular really makes a lot of sense. So when I first learned about the subtypes, I thought I was self-pres 3. And then I was like so much more emotional than all of the self-pres 3s that I met. And more expressive as well. Like I think that a lot of the time self-pres 3s can come across a bit stoic. And I was like, wow, I really respect how like structured and like calm you are. And I do not feel that way. So then I was like, oh, I must be social. And I was like, I mean, I post on social media every day. Like I must be social. What people didn't see behind the scenes is I always had such a conflicted experience of social media. Like I liked getting to know certain people in the comments or the DMs, but I hated being visible. I hated people seeing me. Like that experience I did not appreciate or enjoy. Like this, I know that people will watch this and listen to it, but I'm fine with sharing vulnerable things. That's cool. Whatever. I don't care if they think whatever they think about me. But I think it's also because in this moment, I'm just like talking to you. I'm not thinking about all the people who might watch, right? And so I went through, when we met in one of the CP courses, I think I said social 3. But I would get really frustrated when people would be like, oh, social 3s are like this. I was like, no, they're not. I'm not like that.
Okay.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Where it's like, I don't know, there's just something about it that didn't resonate. But being a Ranio set, I heard them on a podcast. They're saying the social is like a double down on the image. And I was like, I think the image piece is huge for me. The image part of 3s, where it's like really paying attention to how other people experience you. Like I did do that. And I think I just couldn't see or didn't want to see some of I wanted to be a person who was independent and like, I don't need anyone else. I wanted to be that so badly that I didn't allow myself to see how important those experiences of like bonding and merging were throughout my life. And so, I'm in a group with some other women who are from CP as well. And one of them said, so why do you think you're a social 3 again? I'm just curious. And I was like, oh, it's because, why do I think I'm a social 3? So it was like, I kind of, they questioned, and then I was like, it was a 6, actually. I think you asked that. And I was like, great question. And I was like, but I'm not charming. I'm not charismatic. Like, that's how the sexual 3 is. And they're like, no, you are. And I still don't see that, but I have gotten that feedback sometimes. I also can be very quiet and introverted. And people sometimes think I'm a 5, which I take as a compliment. But anyway, so that's how I kind of landed on sexual 3. And then I asked B about it, and she was like, yeah, it seems like a better fit.
Okay. So was it
Yeah.
with B that that finally helped you to land with sexual 3?
I think I'd already been thinking I was sexual 3 for like 6 months, and then going to retreat A and doing some of the inner work that I did there. I was like, yeah, that's pretty solid. Yeah.
How do you understand, because going back to your creativity piece, I forget what the profiling system's called now, but there's like a yellow type, a red type, a green type, and a blue type. So would you be like the yellow, like the sort of they're really good at starting things, and they're really creative, they get things started, but then a bit like the 7, once they've got it started, they've kind of lost interest in that. They want to start the next exciting thing. So there's these overlaps with different personality systems, and I've heard it said that the sexual instinct, among other things, is related to creativity.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah, I definitely think that is true of me. And I think it's been really useful for me to like kind of look outside some of some of the learning that I've done with being Aranio for more on the sexual instinct, mostly because I think it's really useful to learn about your instinct from somebody with your dominant instincts. Because they have more experiential stuff. And so since neither B nor Aranio are the sexual, I looked and found some other insights that I liked that resonated. So I think the chemistry thing is really, really important. So kind of having that sense of like zing, or like a sense of like it's something that you cannot put your finger on, but it's like it's like a spark. That's what I call the sexual instinct when I go into organizations, is spark.
Okay.
So I think like having that spark is really important for sexual instinct. I also think sexual subtypes tend to be really black and white. They're like either all in or all out on things.
Okay.
I learned that from my friend Ellie Pugh. She's a 7. But I think that that's really helpful to learn. And then looking for like merging with your significant other. And I think a lot of the time sexual subtypes can mistype because they merge so strongly with their significant other, with their culture, with their parent, those sorts of things.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting that you say that, because I was thinking about that earlier when you were thinking about, am I 9, am I 7, am I 6, 4? And, if a 3 is shape shifting and adapting their presentation to suit with the different people they're with, it's like they kind of lose themselves in the process, if that makes sense, who they really are.
Yeah. And I think something I've been thinking about a lot is, back to your question about identity earlier, is like having kind of a values-based sense of identity.
Okay.
So, like I'd say my core values are curiosity, kindness, creativity, integrity, and like maybe like lifelong learning, something like that. So those are some of the 5 that I kind of constantly go back to every time I do a values exercise, like once a year or so, just to do that sort of inventory. And I think that a values-based perspective on identity can be really useful for sexual 3s, because who you are could be malleable. And it's also, I think, a way to find that consistency, because those things about me have been true since I was a kid, right? Like those values have always been there for me. And so I think that can be useful.
What's your current understanding of like spirituality? Like what's that journey been like for you?
Yeah. So I was in a church community that was fairly culty. And I left that in 2019. I moved away. Lost all my friends, like literally just started over. And so that was really difficult. And initially I tried to jump right back into a new church community in my that actually represented my values. So I try to jump back in, but I noticed myself really trying to force myself to ascribe to everything that the pastors said at this new church, right? And I was like, oh, I'm just jumping into another sort of like, it wasn't even extreme, but just like another sort of like allowing somebody else to dictate what I believe. And so during the pandemic, we stopped going like a lot of people did, I think. But over the last year, I've been going to like my local Dharma center, like a Buddhist center, and there's like meditations and stuff like that. And recently I've been watching a lot of like I'm still interested in some of the concepts of Christianity, and a lot of it is like thinking about why I think the way that I think, and kind of understanding that. But like I really like the YouTube channel, The New Evangelicals. And then, I kind of appreciate some of those thoughts still, but I think inclusivity is a really important piece of it for me, which can be quite unpopular in some veins of American evangelicalism, which is kind of why I don't really identify with evangelicalism. But I very much am kind of like open. I think that there is probably something spiritual in some spiritual realm, but I don't know exactly what that is. And I don't feel strongly about calling it any sort of thing, except that I will say it's been really healing for me to go back to some of the same thoughts or read some of the same things as I did before, but instead of saying like our Father or using like male pronouns for God, I'm doing the opposite of using like female pronouns or saying like our mother, that sort of thing. And as you can imagine, with having such a harsh and punitive view of God growing up, it's been really useful. And also, I'm social repressed, and I think I am very wary of joining groups. I'm wary of getting sucked in. I really am not certain what to make of that. So,
Sure. Yeah.
Ambiguous.
Yeah. No, thanks for sharing that, Steph. And where we are today, where you are today, where I am today, where people are today in their faith and their belief systems, regardless of what they believe. Like I currently see it as where I am isn't my destination. It's like that journey language. I keep coming back to the journey language, but I haven't reached the destination. Go back to your point about being a lifelong learner. What I thought 5 years ago isn't necessarily what I think today. And what I think in 5 years' time isn't necessarily what I'm going to be thinking today. It might be. But I think I would describe myself more, I'm seeking truth. Like I'm seeking truth. And if something is true, it's true. It's as simple and as complicated as that. But yeah. How would you describe, because I've been around you, I'm jumping around a bit here, but being around you, talk about the third force, and you would have heard them say psychological development is incredibly important. And in fact, if we're going to do anything, we need to grow psychologically. Otherwise, we can be spiritually dangerous. And that is true that's definitely true within Christianity. You know, it is true, and it pains me to say it, but it's true. um, so the psychological growth is really important, and I wonder if we will spend the rest of our lives healing and working on some aspect of our psychological development for whatever it is, you know, for whatever reason. Um, but then this spiritual growth, this third force, like the ego can't combat the ego. I can't. Um, another way of wording it would be the flesh cannot combat the flesh. It's almost as if like it's the spirit that combats the flesh, or it's the third force that there gets a point in our growth path where it's the third force, the spirit. We need to take on a different. I don't know where you with that understanding.
I think that, I mean, first of all, even the concept of having like such an openness about it, like I mentioned, I think earlier, like it's just challenging for me because I do want to be like, all right, I've got this sorted out. I know exactly what I believe. Put that on the shelf and go to the next thing. But I think even in the last year, I've seen a lot of change and a lot of development simply because I think my bent is toward doing more of the psychological work because it feels tangible. I think I've always had a bit of a difficult time with some of the more spiritual things. Of like, well, there's just something we can't understand or can't explain. And I'm like, but can we explain it though? Let's try. And so like, I think that it's a lot easier for me to be like, I'm going to go to therapy every week. I'm going to do my work. I'm going to, you know, do that sort of thing, or really analyze myself or like write these things down. That feels really natural for me. And having these moments of insight or moments of like what I think of as like kind of God now, of like joy or beauty or just like appreciating things in the moment. Like those little moments, I think are kind of like a lot of the spiritual experience that I have now. But I don't necessarily think in those moments that I'm like, oh, this is God, right? It's more like, um, I don't know. I'm just kind of there. But then in moments when I'm like in the retreat or something is when I feel like I can experience that third force entering.
Okay.
I feel like that made no sense because I really got off on a side tangent in my mind. But I'll just share this that I use an acronym for God, which is generous, omnipresent, divine. It's helpful for me because a lot of the work that I've done in the last year has been like in recovery. So for the last 2 years, I guess, but and like in a lot of recovery communities, you have to believe in God in some way. You don't really have to, like there's like some wiggle room, but there's a lot of talk of God. And my concept of God was so connected to that wrathful, vengeful God that I spoke of earlier from my upbringing. And so I had to create like this different perspective that is still the way that a lot of people do see God, but it just is not how I was taught. And so, generous, omnipresent, divine.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I can't claim to know what God thinks and how he feels, but you know, I do sometimes wonder, like when people are teaching on behalf of him or her, like teaching on behalf of God and delivering, this is what God is like, and it's really harsh and really brutal. I don't know. I just imagine it really upsets God. You know, I just imagine it really upsets Jesus. I just imagine that it does. I can't, know that for a fact, but that's I just feel like it's true. And you said something earlier as well. Well, I guess it's like with a, you know, a loving parent isn't going to deliberately ruin uh, their child's life, or, you know, you've been brought into this world, so I'm going to make you think you are deserving of hell and the worst possible place ever, and I'm just going to keep telling you that. It's like,
Mhm.
if a natural parent wouldn't do that to a child, then surely like God wouldn't do that, would he? Or,
Mhm.
but anyway, going back to what you said a minute ago, I keep coming back to this spiritual realm for some reason with you, and you just keep saying, I don't know," and that is, I think that is a really honest and vulnerable answer, and it's one that I'm kind of saying a lot at the moment as well. Like, I don't know. I have faith,
Mhm.
I believe, but, you know, I might be wrong. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and um, I guess I'm discerning whether it's a self-preservation six roundabout. It's convenient that I just live in this I don't know, or whether it is part of the seeking. Is I don't know, and that is
Mm.
like just where I'm at, and that's what I'm hearing from you as well. Just
Mhm.
you're not necessarily doing the three thing of I've got this sorted and I'm teaching it, you know, and it's the three steps.
Yeah.
Do these three steps and you'll be fine, or whatever it is,
All
you know.
right. Yeah.
I want that for a six, and I want certainty. I want, you know, just give me certainty, give me certainty. So I want the three to teach me and tell me what it. I want the certainty, but the reality is do we? What certainty do we have?
Yeah. Well, and I think that's one of the things that is a through line in like the Facets of Unity by A.H. Amos, or even Spiritual Dimension of the Enneagram by Sandra Maitri. And like we have these big questions, and there is a lot of talk of God or like divine being in those books, and it can be challenging to wrestle with if you have a very strict view of what that means. Whether that's there is no God, or this there is one way that God is, right? Um, but recently I was in this book club, we're talking about the spiritual dimension of the Enneagram, and she's talking about how our personalities develop and like these different things. And I was kind of like, well, the research actually shows like this, and like it's really hard for me to reconcile. This is like one of the doubts that I have about the Enneagram, is like reconciling some of the research that we have about personality and the way that some of the Enneagram literature claims that it works. Um, and actually, there are some things about personality studies that I've read that I think really work with the Enneagram, but some of the Enneagram stuff says something different. And my friend was like, "Well, this isn't talking about that. This is talking about like in the spiritual realm."
Hmm.
And it was interesting because I noticed how my assumption is like, okay, well then that's not real.
Okay,
Um,
yeah,
but I can also feel, in a sense, well, it is real, right? It is true because I can feel it when I, like, in a spiritual way, like I can understand certain things that I can't really explain. Um, and so it's like, well, it's not the case that it's just not real just because I don't think it fits with this like modern expectation that we have of like objectivity and data, and you know, we could get on a whole tangent about that, but um it's just interesting to like kind of puzzle through all of that,
hmm,
and it's frustrating. I hate it.
yeah, yeah. And I guess there's like the the centers of intelligence, like the head
Mhm.
center, where like it's limited in a head great at thinking and logic, you know, the emotions great at feeling and not necessarily logical, and the body center, you know, we need the head, the heart, the body, and the spiritual realm, and all of these different pieces. Um, and we're trying to explain something with the head that isn't necessarily a head center topic, if that makes sense. It's hard to put words and it's hard to describe. It's like, what does the wind? I know this is a well-known thing, but what does the wind look like? I don't know. I can't see it. I don't know what it looks like. I can't see it. How do you explain something that you can't see using words? But I can feel it.
And you can see its impact on other things.
Yeah.
Like on the trees or, yeah.
So how has knowing you're a sexual 3 been most helpful to you?
Well, I think it's been really helpful in my relationships, in particular. I think especially that's been probably the best, use that I found for the Enneagram. So like, here's an example. As recently, my husband and I, we were both having this, it wasn't like an argument. It was just like a discussion of like, I feel like this need of mine is not being met. And he was like, I feel like this need of mine is not being met. And we're both kind of feeling like it's hard for me to meet that need when this one's not met. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah.
And a few days later, I was like, oh, you were saying the social 6 thing. I was saying the sexual 3 thing. And it was so funny to like look back on that conversation and recognize like, oh, that makes sense. Like we're coming at this from these 2 different perspectives. And so it's been really useful to understand that. I also think that it's useful for me to identify how important it is. I think just in general, but especially like in relationships, I always want, and like in my work, I always want something to feel like new and like kind of exciting. And a lot of work is like not that new and exciting. Like it can be new and exciting a little bit, but then you also have to do the thing if you want to be successful at it. And sometimes the desire for newness and excitement wins out over the desire to like do a good job at something. And I just move to the next thing. And so I think that identifying that as well has been really useful.
Okay. Yeah. So it's been helpful in with your relationships, even though you've been learning about the Enneagram since 2015. So getting on for 9 years, getting on for 10 years. It sounds that sometimes you're still going about in real life, and then on reflection after this like discussion or this life event, you look back and go, of course, yeah, you're doing the social 6 thing. I'm doing the sexual 3 thing, which is so true. And that's been my experience as well, is when I could kind of go unconscious, or I'm in my life, I'm not necessarily thinking about the Enneagram in that moment. It's only on reflection. Of course, these themes are going to keep coming up again and again and again, in various ways. But it's interesting how I can't meet this need. I can't meet this need until this need is met, and vice versa.
Yeah, because I think we just, our attentions naturally go to the thing that's not being met, based on our type and our lens, and our subtype lens. And so I think that that's how that plays out. And I think it's really challenging at times because my repressed instinct is my husband's dominant.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I've heard it said that people with the same dominant instinct can tend to have it. I think every sequence and type will bring its own strengths and own challenges. So, me and my partner both share a self-preservation dominant instinct, which in some ways is great. But the downside to that is we're going to have a harder time to grow out of it because we're both loving being in it to a point. But at least you and your husband are able to, from a growth path point of view, that's helpful for you. But I imagine it's challenging as well sometimes. But then it could look different with the social 6, couldn't it? With the fear piece, perhaps.
Yeah. I don't think he's much of a joiner either in terms of groups.
Yeah.
And so that's challenging because I do think community is really important. But I'm so resistant to committing to it.
To the group.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like even I would never be caught dead wearing like my school colors on school spirit day or something. Like even when I was a kid, I would be like, I'm not doing that.
Okay.
Like,
Is that like the individualist thing coming in?
yeah, I think it's like the social repressed thing.
Okay. I don't want to be part of that group.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if that's where your sister was coming in thinking, that's the four going on, that's the individualist coming on, but it's not necessarily. Obviously, there's the wing there, so that's going to have an impact,
Yeah.
of course. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. And I think she's a 3 and a different subtype. And so that is like,
Okay.
we're really different. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I met another couple who I believe are both fours. One's self-preservation, one's sexual four. Um, and the sexual four has been going around thinking she's in different numbers. But yeah, they are radically different. The subtypes, they can be radically different, can't they? Even though it's the
Yeah.
same number.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think
Yeah.
sometimes people have given me feedback like, oh, you're not successful enough, or you're not, no, I think I'm not successful enough. People say you're not confident enough to be a 3, or
Mm.
you don't seem like you're trying to be sexy enough to be a sexual 3.
Okay.
Or you don't seem like you're trying to be attractive to anyone. So you must not be a sexual 3. And I mean, those things have caused me like a little bit of a wobble at times for sure. But I think that ultimately, like, well, I'm the person who knows what my inner experience is like, which as a
Absolutely.
3 is like a big thing to say.
Yeah,
So I
absolutely.
have to go with what I think is clear.
Yeah, and as you'll know, as we grow and develop, we're gonna be more complicated, more sophisticated is what the word Arani uses, isn't it? We become more
Yeah.
sophisticated in our type, so
Mhm.
that can cause problems for typing as well, can't it? Where people have grown, whether they are aware of the Enneagram or not.
Yeah.
What I find really validating about the Enneagram is people that aren't into it, like I am, who like someone I used to know, um, she was a type 9 and identified as a type 9. I did a typing session with her. It came out as type 9. But she's been on a growth path and has been becoming more confrontational, getting more in contact with a 3 arrow. And if I didn't know the Enneagram, I'd be like, this is kind of like a different person. But it isn't. It's and I
Yeah.
find it fascinating how she hasn't deliberately tried to grow as a 9 would grow. She's just been focusing on her inner growth path. She's just been focusing on growing, and it turns
Yeah.
out that it's mapping the type 9 growth path. I find that kind of thing really interesting.
Yeah, me too. And I think that's where I constantly go back to like, yes, this is helpful and it works. Because I see that a lot.
Mm,
And of course, I sometimes meet people who are still like at a really low level of awareness and are like later in their career and that sort of thing too. Because like I said, I work mostly with corporate. But a lot of people, they're like, yeah, I was getting this feedback on my performance reviews all the time, and then I went this way with it, and I'm like, yeah, that's the growth path. So
yeah, that's really good. Steph, is there anything that I haven't asked that you would like to share?
I think the big thing that is helpful for people to recognize is a difference between the sexual instinct and the sexual subtype. So how the sexual instinct plays out, and then how the sexual subtype, um, or how their subtype plays out. So the instinct is about chemistry, like looking for like a spark or a sense of adrenaline or intrigue. They like feeling mystery, but there's a lot of polarity too. So it's like push and pull, like either I really like you or I really don't like you. But sometimes that can switch, you can kind of go the opposite direction. A lot of the time, sexual um, instinct dominant people are not neutral about many things. They're just kind of like go all in or all out. And then also they want to merge and bond with somebody else. That doesn't always mean it's a partner. It could be with somebody outside of that, like a friend or a parent or sibling, somebody like that, but they like to have that experience of merging. And it's not just about personality merging like we talk about with 9s, but also like kind of their energy. Like for 8s, it's like consuming the other person's energy, and So a lot of 8s talk about that. So I think that it's important to notice how that plays out in your life. And then the sexual subtype. So for type 3, that's about that specific other person. You care a lot what they think. If they think you're a good person, if they think you're doing well. So it's kind of like molding your personality specific for that person. And that takes up a lot of your thought process. And then also sexual 3s really want to help other people succeed a lot. So they kind of put a lot of their passion into helping other people and tend to not like to do things alone that much, which I have been doing a lot of in the past few years, and I don't love it. I was like being all alone all the time. Not all the time, but. And then also I think sexual 3s see a lot of their value and worth in their appearance and how successful they can be in attracting other people. And it's important to know that sexual 3, like the image part, people talk about it being like a Barbie or a Ken. That's not necessarily like, if you want to attach to like the plasticiness of that, that's fine. But it's actually about your family of origin, your culture, those sorts of things. So what was a good and perfect person? What messaging did you get around that concept growing up? And that's probably more so going to dictate how you show up as like the image of perfection versus something that, is from the culture at large, but might not necessarily play into your life that much. So I think that's a really useful thing. And give the 3s in your life some love. They might seem like they don't need it, but they do.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that, Steph. You shared so many things there that any 3s or people that are in relationship with 3s, brothers, sisters, partners, children, parents, are just going to find that incredibly helpful. So thank you for sharing that, Steph. So I know that, yeah, you're welcome. So I know that you also work professionally with the Enneagram. Can you just share more about what it is that you do and where people can find out more about your work and website and email contact so they can just come and find you?
Sure. So I have a podcast, which is called Enneagram in Real Life, where I interview people about what it's like to be their Enneagram type. And I also interview other experts who have something to say about how we can support our Enneagram journeys with ideas from other disciplines. And that's called Enneagram in Real Life, wherever you listen to podcasts. I also primarily work with teams. So I do a lot of corporate workshops, offsites, retreats, things like that. So I kind of tailor everything to fit whatever the team needs. But a lot of the time I'll do like typing interviews with each person on the team, and then a 1 to 2 day team offsite, and then we can recap afterward. So that's normally how I approach that. And I have lots of topics and worksheets and all that good stuff that go along with that. But primarily I help people understand how to communicate better and work together better in their teams through the lens of the Enneagram. And it's been just really fun and exciting. I've been doing it for 6 years now. So it's just a really enjoyable thing. And yeah, I love working with people in that capacity. I also have an Instagram, which is called 9types Co, all spelled out. And my website is 9types.co.
Lovely. Yeah, that sounds amazing.
Yeah, it's so fun. I love working in corporate, and I just find that it can be really helpful for people and their mental health too, of like helping improve their work life a little bit can make a huge impact in their overall experience of life, because we spend so much time at work. And this has always been something I've been interested in since undergrad. So here I am all these years later, doing the same type of work.
Steph, just from what you've shared, I can clearly hear how you've grown and you are growing. And, you are an inspiration to all of us that are on as what we would call the path. And, as you've testified, the being alone piece and the various ways that you've been, growing in your subtype isn't easy. But yeah, it's really important. And yeah, I've been very inspired by what you've shared, and I'm sure many people that listen to it will be as well. Steph, is there anything else you'd like to share before we close off?
No, thanks for listening.
Cool. Well, yeah, thank you for all you've shared. It's been incredibly insightful, and I wish you all the best for the future. And yeah, thank you for sharing.
Thank you.